Excellent. So let's go ahead and reflect together on how that felt. So share with me, how did you enter the conversation? How did it look and feel as it happened? And where'd you end up? Who would like to start off? Mhm. It's a very cordial beginning. Very nice. Yeah. Mhm. Very nice. Did you share your opinion too? Beautiful. And must I say, as the onlooker to it all, the energy was so high and so positive. So thank you for participating in that. Now, this is very common with icebreakers. We can just dive in. We don't need a particularly intentional approach or mindset. We can kind of meander throughout the conversation, and wherever we end up is okay because we're not trying to reach a definitive endpoint. But let's go ahead and take a little bit of a closer look at the definition of hot takes themselves. So, a hot take, according to Merriam-Webster here, is a quickly produced, strongly worded, and often deliberately provocative or sensational opinion or reaction. Taking one more definition, it is a statement that's provocative enough that people can't help but weigh in their thoughts. It's usually a controversial opinion that has no factually right or wrong answer. Now, when I read these definitions, icebreaker isn't the first thing that comes to my mind. Instead, I think about just how we have come to communicate with each other, where we talk in very quickly produced, strongly worded, looking to get a reaction out of somebody kind of speech. And so let's go ahead and look at what this looks like when the topics become more sensitive. So some real world examples that we may have taken, that we may have encountered in real world, such as in politics. So if we take hot take number 3 that falls in line with the definition that we just saw, women who get an abortion are murderers. Or hot take number 4, gun rights activists value their guns more than the lives of children killed in school shootings. This is the type of statements that we have come to communicate with each other with. But when they hit on such foundational, critical aspects of our lives, what we just talked about in our reflection of our own icebreaker, that whole not approaching it intentionally, not being conscientious with how we structure the conversation, and having an unproductive endpoint, those are no longer acceptable. But that's often what we're left with. And so if we zoom out, what this looks like is we're left with judgmental headlines, inflammatory social media posts, untrue political mailings, disrespectful government debates. And all of that serves to stifle civil discourse, the ability to engage with somebody who has an opposing belief than ours and do two things at once: care for and share our own beliefs while not disparaging or damaging their beliefs. And when civil discourse is stifled, we paint ourselves into this world of false dichotomies where things are either right or wrong, fair or unfair, moral or amoral. And it just so happens that all of us independently have stumbled across that perfect mix of beliefs where everything we believe is right, fair, and moral. And if somebody disagrees with us, they're in the other box. And this is a very alluring perspective on the world. Its simplicity is next to seductive. And so, what I ask of you, though, is to second guess that simplicity and ask what we're really sacrificing here. And to think about, even in our young nation, how such hard and fast divisions very, very rarely ever work. Think about north or south, black or white, religious or secular, male or female, Republican or Democrat, peace or war. So often we say it's us versus them. You are either with us or you are against us. You are either my ally or you are my enemy. And it's that feeling that if we go and communicate with the other side, that we're crossing into enemy territory, that's the barrier to civil discourse that we're up against. And the erosion of civil discourse is the erosion of democracy itself. And that erosion feels like being in this state where we're stuck in political divide, disengagement, and violence. And speaking for myself and as a relatively young person, I will say before Michael Ford approached me for this workshop to put it together for you all, I felt this. I felt the political divide, I felt the disengagement, and I knew about the violence, but I didn't feel a sense of urgency about it. I thought, well, we've had a democracy for almost 250 years now. It's worked. It's had its ups and downs. It seems like a good way to do things, though. So it'll persist, and it'll persist without my interventions and without my efforts. And while I was putting this together, I came across two quotes that changed that. The first was that when asked what type of government they had built, Benjamin Franklin said, "A republic, if you can keep it." The second is from Ronald Reagan, and it said, "Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction." Those two quotes hit hard for me because they help to illuminate that the fundamental aspect of our government, this absolutely key to our everyday lives, is both fundamental and fragile. And I asked myself, when something is fundamental and fragile in our lives, do we ignore it and disengage? Do we attack it and resort to violence? And the answer is no, we nurture it. And so that's what we're here to talk about tonight, how to de-escalate these charged political topics that divide us to nurture civil discourse, ultimately restoring this foundational value of democracy. And so digging into this a little bit more, we are going to talk about how to de-escalate these heated exchanges and create that space for meaningful dialogue between people of differing beliefs. In part one, which is the majority of the workshop, we'll talk about de-escalation fundamentals. And that is all that preparation for the moment, if you will. And like most things in life, a lot of the work goes into the preparation. And then we'll actually go into how to have the conversation, the moment itself, and that portion will be shorter. So what this workshop is not, it is not crisis management. If you feel that your physical safety or emotional safety is threatened, I am not qualified to tell you what to do other than what you feel comfortable doing. However, what I will say is a quick definition of emotional safety that doesn't get talked about a lot is to engage with people who don't dehumanize you. Because when they start to dehumanize you, they start to strip you of your rights as a human, and it's a slippery slope into threatening your physical safety as well. And so the ask, though, that I have is to make the distinction in your mind between when your physical and emotional safety are being threatened versus when your worldview and beliefs are feeling threatened. They are two very different things. And the latter is typically a sign that you should lean in, because you might have something to learn about yourself, somebody else, or the world at large. The fundamentals that we'll cover are why these topics become escalated in the first place, why we typically approach these topics so poorly as people, and how to actually de-escalate the situation. Then in part two of the conversation, we'll talk about how to have the civil discourse itself and how to truly connect while having it. There are a couple rules of engagement I have for you all this evening. I ask that you be present. Thankfully, you all came here physically, and we are so happy to have you. And there are a lot of things that are competing for your attention right now. So please do try to be present with each other and really engage here. and to engage respectfully and compassionately. We are going to talk about some difficult topics tonight. Hot takes 3 and 4 gave you a little preview into that. And so I ask that you help create the psychologically safe environment. And to help with that, choose curiosity over judgment. Allow yourself to explore new mindsets and be patient with your discomfort while you're doing so. I'm going to ask that you come across a belief that may not be your own. Maybe it's one that you don't hold, but hold on to it long enough to grapple with it, to try to understand it a little bit better, and then you can set it aside. You don't have to carry the belief with you further, just long enough to try to understand it. And lastly, ask questions at any time. Feel free to interrupt the PowerPoint. So at this point, does anybody have any questions before we dive in? Seconds are okay. So if you want to get more food, feel free to do so at any point. That was the one question no one wanted to ask. All right. So why these topics become escalated in the first place? So we're going to talk about what gets in the way of civil discourse. It's not enough to just say we want civil discourse and to chase it. We need to first look at what the barriers to it are. And so we'll start with the Brené Brown quote here. As much time as I spend researching the way, I spend 10 times the time researching what gets in the way. And I think that that's a beautiful quote telling us to not just look over the barriers to the civil discourse that we so badly want and get frustrated when we're not getting there. Instead, turn our visions closer to what those barriers truly are and take the time to understand them. Because by understanding them, we'll have the patience to overcome them. And that patience is going to be absolutely key in what we talk about tonight, because it is very easy to judge or dismiss people with different beliefs than our own when things get escalated. You've probably thought to yourself at one time or another, they are such an idiot. They're not worth my time. They don't know what they're talking about. They've been fed misinformation. What a brainwashed lunatic. And we must put the onus on ourselves to resist that reflex to judge and dismiss, and instead have patience. So we'll cover a couple perspectives here to help build that patience within ourselves. The first concept we're going to cover is Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how it connects to political topics that are commonly discussed. So a common concept in psychology is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a theory on human needs and how they affect our behavior. So it goes from our lowest level needs, our physiological needs, such as air, water, shelter, sleep, etc. And then it moves up into more advanced needs. So once we have our physiological needs met, we move into safety, personal security, resources, employment, our health. And then we can move into love and belonging. That's how we connect with one another, that feeling of friendship and family and intimacy. And once we have that, we're able to really focus a little bit more on ourselves in the larger context of society. And we're able to look at our esteem, whether that's our status or our recognition, our strength as individuals and freedoms. And then last but not least, self-actualization, the desire and pursuit to become the most that we can be. And so the primary concept in Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that lower level needs must be met before higher level needs. And so if you're operating up here in the esteem bucket and you're trying to build your career and build some recognition for yourself, and now Hurricane Helene or Milton or any of the other names are coming towards you and they're threatening your property, they're threatening your shelter, you're going to shift your focus down and defend those needs and try to meet those needs. And so the important connection in terms of politics and de-escalation of heated conversations is recognizing that people will defend those needs when they feel threatened, Whether they are truly being threatened or not, it doesn't matter. If they feel they are threatened, they go down to defend those. And political topics really tend to hit hard on these foundational needs. So we'll even take physiological needs as an example. Some common political topics that hit on those: abortion, sexual offenses and what happens to sexual offenders, housing, pollution, climate change. All of these topics are so sensitive because they hit on the very basics that we need to survive as people. Then when we look at safety needs, gun control, violent crime, healthcare, economy, the taxes, foreign policy, wars, etc., all of those hit on our needs for security, employment and resources and health. And people will work to defend those if they feel threatened. And lastly, we'll cover love and belonging to see how these puzzle pieces fit into the pyramid. Think about LGBTQ plus community and those issues surrounding them, racial equity, gender equity, immigration, isolation, such as what we saw imposed throughout the pandemic. They all impact that fundamental human need to belong and to be around people who love us. And so this is one thing that you can reflect back on when people do respond very defensively. Remember that these topics alone can be enough to drop somebody in that pyramid and to make them feel defensive. We'll cover another topic in terms of helping us build this patience with why these topics become escalated. And that's that our perception is our reality. And so how we view the world is the world to us. So when someone asks you to change your mind, they're asking you to change your world. And that change inevitably makes you suffer a loss of some kind. Maybe that's respect for someone you cared for. Maybe you grow up with a father who taught you that women are sexual objects. And as an adult, you grew up to respect women. And since you gained that respect, you lost some respect for the man who taught you to think that way. Perhaps it's camaraderie with your friends. Maybe your friends taught you that drugs were really cool and they were the way to hang out together. And then you start reading up on all the fentanyl overdoses and you see how dangerous it is. And maybe your heightened self-preservation leads to you losing those friendships. Maybe it's trust in your upbringing. Maybe your parents taught you that everything outside of your hometown, the entire world outside there, is dangerous and you shouldn't go there. And then you start exploring as an adult and you realize that there are good people everywhere and there's an amazing sense of common humanity that binds us all together. And though you've gained that, now you question, what else were you told that wasn't true? Or last, maybe it's a very part of your identity. Maybe you grew up where it was in a religion that taught you there are only two genders. And maybe later in your life, you realize that that's not the case for you. And you don't identify as one of the binary genders. And so by gaining that sense of identity, you've now lost your identity piece that was your religious affiliation. And so the next time you come across someone and you're thinking to yourself, why won't they just change their mind on this topic? You know, why won't they just see the facts or listen to me or come around to my position? Ask yourself, what would they be sacrificing if they did? What loss might they suffer by changing their mind? It is an extremely scary prospect, all of these losses. And so be patient with them, because there may be a lot of fear there, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And it doesn't stop there. Not only are we asking them to suffer a loss, we're then saying, okay, now take that feeling of loss and now humbly enter a less familiar place, a less familiar way of thinking, where your family probably isn't with you, your friends might not be with you, people question you because you didn't always think this way, you came from somewhere else, and where you have a lot to learn. Imagine that you're standing on this mountaintop and the skies are clear around you, you understand the world and you see it for what it is, and things are clear. And then someone comes up and they say, hey, I'm going to try to push you into that fog because what you're seeing isn't real and you need to get through the fog to see reality. You're going to resist that because it's a very scary prospect to enter that fog with that sense of loss on your shoulders. And so, in summary, these topics become so escalated because they hit on our foundational needs as humans. They threaten our views of the world and of our very selves, and they threaten us with a loss of some form that is typically very significant to us when it comes to these topics. And then they ask us to enter the unfamiliar with humility. Before we go into the next section, does anybody have a question they would like to pose or a comment they would like to share? Yes, Sam. I love it. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sam. I appreciate you sharing that. All right. If you have any other questions or comments, feel free to pipe in at any time. All right. So we talked about why they become escalated so easily. Now let's talk about why we typically approach these topics so poorly as people. And we'll start with a quote from William Jones. Whenever you're in conflict with someone, there is one factor that can make the difference between damaging your relationship and deepening it. Any guesses? Good idea. William Jones, in his opinion, though I'm sure we could fill that blank in with many words, is that the factor is attitude. Now, the word attitude and I have an interesting relationship. I think we were all teenagers at one point and had an interesting relationship with the word attitude. But this I came across only a few months ago after I've been on this long journey to have a better perspective towards conflict. And it was a light switch moment for me. This quote has stuck with me so much that now when I am personally confronted with a conflict, instead of thinking, oh shit, I think, okay, this is an opportunity to either damage or deepen this relationship. So act accordingly, Kate. And now I hope that it's that helpful to you. But like I said, there's a lot of different types of attitudes towards conflict. So let's kind of see where you might be. You might be where you feel physically ill when you're around conflict, that it's bad, that you avoid it at all costs, and you try to keep it out of your life. There was a wonderful volunteer of ours. She took our mediation skills training and she said, I just don't want to feel sick to my stomach when people are disagreeing around me anymore. And I'm thankful to say that she accomplished that and much more. But that is legitimately where some people are. There's also where you might feel discomfort, where conflict is just unpleasant. You'll stick it out, but you're not going to be happy while you're there. Or you might just feel a general dislike for it where it's necessary to deal with it. You're like, okay, let's get this over with and let's move on. You might feel genuinely neutral. And this is the toughest place to be. Genuinely neutral, just seeing conflict as a part of life. It's an opportunity. It's not good or bad. It's just part of the world. Or you might feel some positive adrenaline from it. You might like how it feels. You might engage with it when it's around you and you think it's pretty great. Or you love it so much where you're one of those people who will create conflict when it's not present. We all have somebody in mind for that comment. And so, yes, of course. because I have found that this is very conditional. We can sometimes feel neutral towards conflict when it's other people's conflict, and we have a lot easier of time with that. But as soon as the conflict touches on something in our lives or something that's important to us or even something that we're interested in, usually some of these other feelings start bubbling up. If you've already attained that, Michael, wonderful job. It is a long journey for some folks. Any other questions from a follow-up? Oh, all right. And so brings up a good point that you likely don't fit into any single one of these boxes because your attitudes toward conflict may change with context. And so maybe if your spouse brings up an issue and a concern they have about your marriage, maybe you start feeling physically ill in that type of conflict. If you're at work and it's just a dispute with another coworker, maybe you're like, all right, I'm not liking it, but we can deal with this so that we can get on with our work lives and get this done. Or maybe when you're in a heated debate with your political opponent, you're just loving it and you're just tossing fuel on the fire because you think it's so thrilling and you just love to try to entrench in your position. And so no matter where you are on the spectrum, in whatever context there is, typically our attitude has a negative impact on our situation. It's something we carry in with us. So think about, you have a family holiday that you're going to go to. If you're dreading it, odds are you're going to have a bad time. If you're feeling, all right, let's go talk with some folks we haven't seen for a while, odds are you're going to have a better time. It's the attitude you bring into the situation with you. And as we saw, if you're outside of this box, odds are you're somehow contributing negatively to that situation. And so again, striving for that neutral attitude that lends you the calm to enter the conversation, but then also the grit to see it through to the end to a resolution. And these attitudes towards conflicts are something we learn very early on in our lives. And so it's based on our experiences as people, what's modeled for us, what has worked well for us, and what hasn't worked well for us in the past. And the same is true for our default reaction to conflict, which I have another continuum for you here. And so maybe you avoid conflict, and that's your default reaction. So the attitude is what you carry in with you, and now we're going into your initial gut reaction to entering that conflict. Maybe you accommodate and you just try to please people so that they will just let the conflict go away. Maybe you advocate. And there's kind of two aspects to this one. Maybe you advocate in a positive manner where you're advocating for your own needs while listening to the needs of the other person. Or maybe you're doing it more in the negative fashion, some kind of more traditional negotiation practices, if you will, where you advocate so strongly for your position that you are trying to trample over the others. Maybe you turn to appeal. So you appeal to a higher authority and you relinquish some of your power over the situation, some of your control, hoping that they will intervene and make it better. Or maybe you attack and you meet fighting word for fighting word, hit for hit. So once again, where you are on this continuum is a learned placement based on our experiences. And often our defaults are unproductive or destructive because as we look at this spectrum, that positive form of advocacy is really the only constructive one on here. If we're avoiding or accommodating, we're not really addressing the conflict that needs to be addressed. If we're appealing, we're saying we don't have the power to solve this ourselves, and we're relinquishing that and that autonomy that goes with it. And I think we can all understand that the eye for an eye doesn't hold up in modern times very well. And so we said that our attitudes and reactions are something that is learned and becomes very, that gut feeling, that gut reaction to these conflicts. And so the question becomes, okay, we're stuck with these things, at least in the moment, until we work to overcome them. So why do we have these in the first place? And that's where the ladder of inference that is covered. So it's the ladder of inference comes into play. And the ladder of inference helps us to slow down and analyze why we want to act, how we want to act, why we believe what we believe. And so our actions are subsequent to our beliefs, and our beliefs are formed by climbing up this ladder. And so you have your whole pool of observable info, this entire world around us. And then we have the actual observations, what we personally interact with, the selected data, so what we choose to pay attention to, both consciously and unconsciously. And from that, we start assigning meanings at a very young age and all throughout our life. Those meanings eventually conglomerate into more wide-spreading assumptions that can kind of get us in trouble sometimes, but do help us shortcut things in life and are able to make meanings of the world. Then they get into broader-based conclusions, which ultimately end up in our beliefs that we hold so dearly. And then we take action on those beliefs. And so we climb up this ladder to all of our beliefs and all of our actions, but typically we're not conscious of climbing the ladder. Typically what we're left with is just seeing our own and others' actions or hearing their expressed beliefs. And so what's helpful for us today is to use the ladder of inference by climbing down it, to think creatively about why we act how we do and why we believe what we do. So let's illustrate with an example here. Say you and I are political opponents, and I disengage with your political hot take because I believe this is going absolutely nowhere. Because I've concluded you are entrenched in your position. And I've assumed you've intentionally made your language inflammatory in that hot take that you shared. And inflammatory language means you don't want to listen or learn. And I know this because such language was used by my abusive father when he yelled at me for things I had no control over. And he used such language at other times, but my gut is telling me that I should just give up before investing too much energy in this disagreement, just in case, just to save myself from that headache. Now notice, at no point was the reason for my political disengagement that I don't care about our country, that I don't value democracy, that I don't think this topic is important, or that I think you're an idiot. It was something extremely personal and nuanced and specific. And so that's what the ladder of inference helps us think about. It's to respect that people have many potential reasons for their actions and beliefs, and it's a reminder that we should not assume or attribute. And attribute in this case is committing the fundamental attribution error, which is saying that how people behave is who they are. So if you see somebody acting like a jerk and you say to yourself, they're a jerk, well, you've just committed the fundamental attribution error. Congratulations. We do it all the time. And so it's important to slow down and separate people's behavior from who they are. And the ladder of inference helps us with that because it gets us to consider, why might someone do that? Why might they think that? And consider what could have happened in their life to lead them to that belief. So there was a very good book called What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry that I would recommend on how trauma impacts people's behaviors and beliefs later in life. And it helps us flip the question, where when we see somebody behaving or spouting off some nonsense from our own perspective, it gets us to stop saying, what's wrong with you? And start saying, what happened to you? Which helps us think about the ladder of inference and think creatively about the origins for their behavior. And you might think to yourself, geez, Kate, that's a wonderful ladder, but there's like 8 rungs on that and I cannot remember that in the moment, especially when things are escalated. And so we've got a simpler tool here. So let's use the concept of the ladder of inference, but talk about the simple rule of 6. And all it states is to think of 6 reasons why someone acts or thinks the way they do. So we're all good at coming up with the first reason, but it's then asking us to come up with 5 more. So let's go through an example here. This is a real example from a family member of mine who had worked in the South for a little bit, and one of their coworkers turned to them and said, "It's not long until that Black woman is fired." You thought, wow, you're pretty taken aback in the moment. All of us were too at the retelling of the story, and we concluded, well, they said that because they're an insensitive racist. Enough said. Most of us would move on with our lives believing they're an insensitive racist. But the rule of 6 asks us, okay, good job, that's 1. Now think of 5 more reasons why they might have said that. Maybe they feel they are just trying to be helpful to you and they're preparing you for something that they see as a fact. Maybe they understand the culture of that company better and they see the writing on the wall and they're not trying to be racist, they're just trying to help you understand the norms, right, wrong, or indifferent. Or maybe they just like the thrill of gossip. Maybe Black had nothing to do with it. It was just an identifier. And they just love talking about who's going to come and go in the company. That's a different problem. We might still think of them poorly, but it's different. Maybe number 4, they feel intimidated by her skill. Maybe they have this fear that they're trying to express, as poorly as it is, that they're hoping that source of intimidation will go away. Or maybe they're tired and they just didn't filter their thoughts well. I think we've all been there. The more tired we are, the less our filter works. And so maybe they don't really mean to intend it. Maybe their first thought slipped out. And maybe had they been better slept, they would have been more sensitive. Or lastly, maybe it had absolutely nothing to do with them. Maybe you misunderstood them. Maybe they said it's not long until that Black woman is hired. She's on contract. Maybe she's going to come on full time. You don't know unless you ask, and you won't ask unless you think more deeply. All right, so now we're going to have time for an exercise. So you're already in your tables. Feel free to join tables if you need more folks. And I would just have you choose one of these, whichever one resonates with your table, and think through 6 experiences, 6 reasons that might have led a person to holding those beliefs. And each table will share, so be prepared to speak. All right, go ahead. And like I said, feel free to combine tables if you would like. We are at the 2-minute warning. The 2-minute warning. Please be prepared to share in 2 minutes. All right. So let's come back together. You can stay at your tables. Wrap up those last thoughts. All right. Who would like to start us off? Which table is brave and wants to go first and share the reasons? All right.
We're all here because we know each other through our Rotary Club, and since one of Rotary's major initiatives over the last several decades has been the elimination of polio through vaccination programs. Kathy decided that we would deal with vaccines are poison. And, as Rotarians, our first instinct is, well, it's just some anti-vaxxer. But then, well, wait a minute. Other than some of the modern vaccines actually are the disease. So technically, they are poison. And in between there, I don't know what we came up with 6 alternatives. The risk analysis changes based on how scared you are of the disease. So it would have been acceptable at one time. Right. You're right. That
Is everyone able to hear everyone okay? Yes? Okay. You guys do better than me. You don't need the mic. All right. Wonderful. And very topical for Rotary. So I'm glad that you guys chose that one and challenged yourself to think through that more when it's just such a given to you all. You've been on this mission for so many years to eradicate polio. Great job. All right. Who would like to go next? Yes.
It might be a simple matter of semantics. Maybe you're talking about drugs as in insulin. Maybe you're talking about drugs as in cocaine. But that might not be clear from the discussion. Could be a matter of impact. This is a hypothetical thing, but I drink to great excess, and I don't hurt anybody, so it's not that bad.
That is hypothetical. He's my husband and he doesn't.
That's how they connect with people. Maybe that's how they connect with themselves. Maybe it's a matter of, a punishment. Maybe they have respect or love for somebody who does the drug. Maybe somebody that they care about is addicted, so they don't feel like they care about it. Maybe it's legal where they came from, but it's not where you are. or maybe a form of reliance, like, or an active reliance on a certain thing. They have a lot of pain, chronic illness, and they have to rely on
Excellent. Good job. All right. Who would like to share next? Yes. I love how you speak to that one because marketing is so powerful. Mm-hmm. 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 Excellent. Thank you for sharing. And thank you to all those who are spokespeople for their groups tonight. So who would like to go next? Well, I'm seeing some head nods at that table. Let's go ahead. Wow, extra credit. Okay. Mhm. 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 And even if it's not their personal one, if it was any family member, loved one, it's extremely impactful. Mhm. Mm. Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's so critical to speak, especially, just like with the vaccinations that we talked about of modern medicine isn't always how medicine looked. And so those feelings, it might take generations to rewrite attitudes because if you'd had negative experiences in your family from some of the less modern, we'll just say, ages of medicine, that can definitely persist. Yeah.
accountability and for being able to be transparent and open about research and gather colleagues from other countries and other universities. And that there's positive benefits in certain drugs for various mental health conditions, physical conditions, serious like spasm disorders. And like, yeah, they mentioned specifically in regard to trauma and family grief and like complex PTSD, which is now emerging, like long-term trauma from family and all different sources. And that people also feel that if they're doing drugs that isn't like negatively affecting other people, like for example, they're not sharing needles, which could spread disease, or they're not engaging in any harmful behaviors, that they feel it's something they're doing for themselves. It's not a crime. And then I guess the last one would be that, like, I think people are so that they're starting to realize that like when drugs are illegal, they go through so many like different touch points, and those touch points themselves can be problematic. They can be criminal organizations, they can be human trafficking organizations. They can also be the ones adding things like fentanyl and adulterating drugs and things like that. And if drugs are perhaps used to whatever extent, like having a safe and healthy place that's research driven and that's a safer environment, would allow the benefits while reducing the harms.
So many ways to look at and really analyze something that is a 5-word statement. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. All right. I believe we have 2 more. Would you like to, Dave?
Vaccines are poison. We had some of the same ones at the other tables too, but one thing we thought of was maybe they're getting the news from an unreliable source that is spreading misinformation, or maybe the people who are favoring and pushing vaccines are in some way belittling those who disagree with them. So making them feel unimportant or that their views don't have value.
Yeah, if the person trying to convince you to take the vaccine isn't respecting you as a person, why would you? Yeah.
Well, this was mentioned, but maybe they have had themselves have had an adverse reaction of some.
Very much so. You know, I was even thinking after getting my vaccine this flu season, I was down and out for a day after. And I was like, oh, this is just part of it. Because I grew up where that was normal. And I was thinking, I was like, if I hadn't grown up where that was normal and I got it and I felt this bad, maybe I would be questioning it too. All right. And our last table. All right.
Gender or disrespected, and that could cause believe them and agree with their identity. Another reason being just the fact that recognize that they are able to make a decision for themselves and respect that.
Yeah. Sounds like you did well. And I'll say on that too, you know, we have a family member who is trans, and it is something that I still don't fully understand to this day, but I remain curious because it's something that a loved one is going through. And I want to understand what they're going through. But it's going through again all of these reasons of how might they be acting and why might they be acting that way? And why might other people be judging them? And why might they be judging them that way? And there are so many different perspectives out there. So the important, gotta turn my clicker on. Important thing is to remember that there are many different reasons and more that we cannot imagine why people act the way they do and why they believe what they believe. And so be humble in your ignorance of their life. You know, we talk about walking a mile in someone else's shoes, and that wouldn't be enough. Even if we could do that, we have not lived their life. And so being humble in that and remaining curious, using the ladder of inference, if you can remember it, the rule of 6, if you can't, to understand them and not to undermine. We don't use the ladder of inference, we don't use the rule of 6 in order to try to uncover some fallacy of theirs. We're doing it so that we can understand them and be able to engage with them better. So in summary, we approach these topics typically very poorly as people, since our default attitudes and reactions towards conflict are often unproductive or destructive. We kind of saw on both continuums, there's a sweet spot in there that is really hard to achieve. And very few of us get there just from our own childhoods. It's a journey we all go through as an adults as we strive to approach conflict better. And that understanding the origins of our learned defaults helps us reserve judgment and then approach with humble curiosity. Any questions on that section or the exercise you just went through? Sam, you got any comments for us? And we're going to have a great discussion, I'm sure. All right. So we've talked about why these sensitive topics become escalated and why we typically react so poorly to them. So now we'll dive into how do we do this better? How do we treat these with the care that they deserve? And I'm sorry to tell you this, but it starts with you. So just like our previous section started with attitude towards conflict, this section starts with your mindset towards conflict. And Claire Canfield, this is completely taken from his TED Talk. I highly recommend that you watch the entirety of it. It is wonderful, called The Beauty of Conflict. And he helps to summarize the mindset we should enter conflict with. And he summarizes it as vocab so that it's easy to remember. And so we start with vulnerability. That is being willing to be seen and open up to another person. It means taking off our armor, laying down our weapons, and being open to them. And this will feel literally disarming, especially if you are in confrontation with someone you see as your political adversary. But this is where the second point comes in: ownership. You have to take ownership for changing the trajectory of the conflict and making it productive. Because I'm sorry to say, but when you walk out of this room tonight, odds are you're going to have to take the first step. Someone else probably won't. They need you to model a better way to handle conflict together. And what's amazing is that a lot of people will follow in your steps once they see it's safe to do so. But it starts with you taking ownership of moving the trajectory of the conflict. And then communication. It's learning to ask good questions, truly listen, and express your own opinions and beliefs in a way that is non-inflammatory. And we'll talk a lot more about communication the rest of the night. And then there's acceptance, that this is going to be inevitable, that we have conflict between each other, and that conflict, that friction, is what helps us to remove injustices from our society, and it can be helpful. But we have to first accept that they're going to be there. We can't just pretend that they shouldn't be or that we would rather have them go away. It's positive when they're around and well managed. And lastly, to set boundaries. Just as we talked about before, to not compromise your physical or emotional safety, you need to set ground rules for what is okay and not okay behavior. So now that we've mastered our own mindset going in, or at least we have a tool to help us spur that thought as we enter conflict, now let's cover the concept of storm versus calm. How many of you have heard of this concept before? All right, the one guy who took my mediation training, and then 2 more people. All right, so if you can think back to a time where you thought to yourself, wow, they turned on a dime. They seem like a complete stranger. They're not even acting like themselves. Or you think back to a time where you were behaving or thinking in a way or maybe saying something to your spouse or your parent or your friend, and you're like, I hate myself right now for acting like this way, but you couldn't help it. You couldn't control it. The words, the hurt just kept coming out. Those are all cliches and descriptors of being in storm. Essentially, very succinctly put, you are in storm when things are not going okay for you, whatever that means for you. And it means that you are not acting like yourself, because our style, how we behave, how we think, how we make decisions, and how we speak, all of that changes when we're in storm, when things aren't okay. And when someone is in storm, there's a few key things not to do. The first, this was summarized in another TED Talk I saw. For the life of me, I couldn't find it, so please don't judge me for not putting the citation. But they summarized it beautifully as that you do not want to blame, and I screwed it up even. So you don't want to inflame, you don't want to blame or shame them. So don't put fuel on the fire. It's very natural to do so when you're in an escalated, heated discussion and their storm is pushing you into storm. But fight that urge and don't blame them. Don't say the situation is all their fault. We wouldn't be there if it wasn't for them. And don't shame them for who they are and what they believe, because as we've seen, our actions and beliefs are extremely complex in terms of their origins. Also, don't try to control them. Don't say things like, don't say that. Calm down. Just don't go there. That's trying to control them. And I think we can all relate back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs for that sense of freedom being one of our basic human needs, and that autonomy to make our own decisions and choose our path in life. And so focus on controlling yourself, not them. And don't judge them for being in storm. This is something that we have to teach our volunteer mediators, because every time somebody comes to us, they're in conflict. They are in storm, very likely. And so it's teaching our mediators not to come out of a mediation and say, gosh, that guy was just a jerk. Or like, wow, that woman was just the absolute witch. No, it's being able to recognize and have grace that they were in storm. And when we're in storm, we all do things and say things that we regret. We've all been there. And so don't judge them for getting there, because as we've seen, politics very easily pushes people into storm. It makes people feel threatened. It makes them go on the defensive. And that makes things not okay for them. And so recognizing that it very easily pushes people there, or that they might just be there already. Maybe the baby didn't sleep well last night. Maybe they're worried about some test results they're going to get back from the doctor. Maybe they feel like their marriage is going to end soon and they're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You don't know why they might be in storm. It could be as simple as they spilled their coffee that morning. You don't know. And so it's being able to have patience with them and to remember that we've all been there. So now that we recognize storm for what it is, and we know a few things not to do, how do we shift the situation from storm to calm? How do we go from that whirlwind to where all the dust can settle and we can actually speak with each other clearly? And it comes down to the power of a pause and all the wonderful constructive things you can do in the space of a simple pause. Starts with recognizing and not hearing the attack, and recognizing and controlling emotional hijacking. So say you live in America and English is your second language. and somebody comes up to you and they say, you know, anyone who can't speak English doesn't belong in America. You should go back to where you're from. Well, you're probably going to hear the attack in that, and you're going to probably go into storm, and you're going to start going down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you're going to want to defend because you feel threatened, that sense of belonging, maybe even your safety. And it's recognizing that maybe they have a legitimate fear, belief, opinion, whatever it is that they're trying to share, and they're just doing it very poorly. And so it's recognizing that, okay, that attack was there, and I'm going to choose not to hear it in terms of responding to it. I'm going to not respond. I'm going to not let them emotionally hijack me into immediately reacting back. And so that's where stopping before you weaponize your words. Don't fall into that cycle of attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack. It is very tempting sometimes to do that. I love it. We will talk about how to handle that. The biggest thing that I will say is it looks very boring to shift from storm to calm. It is not an exciting process. It is a very calm process. And so we'll talk about exactly how to do that. All right. And in that pause, also self-regulate. So whatever that means to you, picture your happy place if you happen to have a mind's eye, or take deep breaths, or whatever it means for you to calm down physically so that you can calm mentally. And going back to vocab from that TED Talk, taking responsibility for building a psychologically safe space. Again, the other person probably isn't going to do this. They're not going to put the onus on themselves to do it. You have to make the space for it. And we'll talk about why that is so worthwhile to do that hard work. And then we're going to approach with curiosity. We're going to talk a lot more about this too. But first, we're going to do another exercise. And so I am going to be leading you all through an approach on how to do this in a conversation. But I first want to do an exercise so that you have basically an analogy, a metaphor that's playing in your mind to help you visualize this approach throughout. So it's called hand to hand. Now I will use my husband as a prop. All right, so everybody pair up with somebody else that you don't know, that you haven't met yet. Hope you don't mind I said you were a prop.
That's okay. As long as I'm a good prop.
Yes. Oh, you two do know each other. Go break up another group. That's okay. Who doesn't know these two? Beautiful. All right. So now stand as we are standing, where one person's back is to that wall and one person's back is to those windows. But front to front. Perfect. So you're facing each other and your backs are opposite ways. All right. So everybody's like this? All right. So now go ahead and stance yourself like this, where your right foot is a little forward and your left foot is a little bit back. Yep. All right. So now put your hand out in front of you with the back of your hand facing your partner. Perfect. And kind of hold it at like belly button height. All right. We've got lots of complex instructions here. Okay. So everyone who is on Jaden's side of the room, follow those, identify yourselves. Yep. All right. So on the count of 3, try to move your partner's hand towards their belly button. Don't do it too aggressively. Just try to push them a little bit. All right. What was that? You're going to try. The person on J, yep,
Push. That direction.
towards your partner. Yep. All right. On go. Everybody know what they're going to do? All right. On go. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay. Now stop. Can disengage. What happened? Beautiful. You all did it. You did what is so natural for us. Yes. So when met with force, we typically meet it with force back. We have that resistance. It is so, so natural. And remember that vulnerability we talked about? Literally your soft spot, your belly. That's why we choose that spot in this exercise. And so what we're going to do now is change the script. We're going to rewrite our default. And instead of meeting force with force, we are going to yield and redirect. So this is a concept from Tai Chi, if any of you are familiar with Tai Chi. And so what it looks like, we'll demonstrate once more. So it's still the same stance. And as one person pushes, the other tries to move at exactly the same force. And eventually, you end in a place where the first person can't move anymore, or they'd put themselves off balance. That's the natural inflection point. So then the other person starts pushing and directing until I can't move anywhere. And then we keep moving like that, keep trying to be perfectly in sync with each other. Does that make sense? All right, give it a try. I thought somebody had interlaced fingers at one point, but they don't. I'm going to advance the slide too, but that's everything I need you for. Thank you. All right. I love the smiles. Okay, so go ahead. Good job, everyone. You're welcome to sit back down. All right, terrific job. So let's reflect. How did it feel to meet force with yielding and redirecting? How'd it feel? Like, we're not in conflict, like we're dancing. I love it. Who can be mad when they're dancing? Yes. Any other feelings? Yes, so less effort when redirecting than pushing back. Excellent observation. Exactly, exactly. And can you imagine how that's a shared vulnerability then? Because as each give and take, each person ends up being vulnerable in that moment. Very good. Yes, Sam. Mhm. Mhm. I'm so glad that that will be helpful for you, Sam. Yeah. And I will say that word redirecting is so critical. Imagine if we didn't have that as part of the exercise and it was just yield. Whew. So there's a lot of us would bristle And I even did the first time I came across this. I thought, what do you mean I have to yield to my adversary first in order to have an impact on the situation? Doesn't that mean I'm agreeing with them or saying that they're right or giving in or giving up my control? And it's not at all, because it's just like we saw. It's a yield and redirect. The yielding gives us the space and opportunity to then redirect the conversation and change the dialogue. And also, we sure ended up somewhere differently at the second round of the exercise, didn't we? It seemed a lot of you stayed here when we met force with force. And then when we went to yielding and redirecting, some people ended up over here or up here, and we moved there together. So we actually made visible progress together. Whereas when we met force with force, we didn't. So maybe you're thinking, geez, Kate, that's great. Maybe I'll take up Tai Chi. But how do we do this in a conversation? So now let's go ahead and talk about that. So I boiled it down to 4 steps for you, and we'll draw the analogy at each. So first is showing curiosity. Let the other person move you. This is where we resist our instinct to meet force with force, and we start that movement. Then it's listen for interests. It's becoming in tune with each other. So as we move, trying to anticipate their force and direction. And then it's proving we listened, consciously addressing the turning point, that inflection point where they've exhausted moving in their direction, and now you're about to redirect them. And then it's look to the future, and it's gently redirect the focus of the conversation. So I'll give you a personal example before we dive into each of these steps. My grandparents are in a situation in a moment where my grandfather is in respite care and my grandmother is recovering from an injury at home. And so a couple months ago, I called my grandma and she said, Kate, I am so glad you called. I have a plan and I want to get your thoughts on it. I said, okay. Took a pause, and I said, tell me more. So her plan was that she was going to go to bed early, so she could wake up early, so she could get my grandfather in his wheelchair, just wheel him outside the facility as if they're going on a walk, pack him up in the car, and take him home. And so I paused because I love my grandma. And I did not respond with laughter. Or with, you're crazy, that will never work. That's a terrible idea, don't do it. No. Instead, I said, I showed curiosity. This is a true story. I did not make this up for this workshop. And I showed curiosity and I said, you know, I'm not really up to speed with what's been going on with you two. Can you tell me more about your situation? Can you share some more details with me? And so she explained how there had been a recent COVID outbreak at the respite care facility, and she was worried about his health and his mental well-being from the isolation of the lockdown on his floor. I said, okay. And so I listened for those interests, for the love of her husband, his health, etc. And I proved I listened. I said, look, Gran, I get it. If my husband was in this situation and I was you, I'd want to break him out of respite care and bring him home. I get it. But then I looked for towards the future, and I helped her do the same. I said, okay, so let's walk through this together. What would this look like? You get to the facility, you get him to the car. Can you get him in the car? She said, no, I probably can't get him in a car because it'd be a little too cumbersome. Okay, let's even assume the best. So you got him in the car, you got him home. Can you get him in the house? She said, well, it would be difficult. I said, okay, let's say you call your son, he helps you get him in the house, and now he's in the house and he's in his bed. Now what does your life look like? And she said, well, I'd tell him to stay in bed and I'd take care of him. I said, do you think he'd listen to you? Would he stay in bed? She's like, no. She's like, your grandfather is too stubborn and he would leave bed eventually and probably get hurt again, and then we'd be worse off. And so she drew her own conclusion from that. And we worked together then. After we scrapped the first plan, we built a new plan together. and we were able to move forward. And so that is a personal example, but this yield and redirecting of conversation works in so many areas of life. It works in our mediations that we do as a center, and it can work in civil discourse as well. And so let's look more closely at each of those steps. Showing curiosity. Encourage them to share more. Odds are they started off with something brief, and you've just made a whole slew of assumptions. So just start off with asking them to share more. And ask open-ended questions that are non-defense inspiring. So many times we just say, well, ask an open-ended question. And we think if we did that, we did good. Well, we definitely need to add the second part of non-defense inspiring, because as we saw, it's so easily to get people on the defense when we start talking about these topics. So let's take our example of hot take number 3 back. Women who get abortions are murderers. Now, you might be tempted to respond, why would you think that? Well, that's an open-ended question. Sure does inspire defense, though. That question, why, is one that we also try to stay away from in mediation because it is asking somebody to explain themselves, and that typically puts them on the defense. All right, so if it's not that, how about what evidence do you have to back that up? It's a legitimate ask. You want to know what evidence drew them to that conclusion. However, it sounds a little bit like the judicial process, like you're putting them on the stand saying, defend yourself. What is your evidence? And I will piece apart your evidence. All right, so if it's not that, who are you to say that? Oh, well, now you're questioning their very identity as a person who holds beliefs and opinions. So instead, it sounds more like, tell me more about how you feel on this topic. What helped you draw that conclusion? And even this is a very carefully crafted question. So in mediation, I used to say, what led you to that conclusion? And I started thinking about that more. And I started thinking about everyone's desire for self-determination and autonomy. And I thought maybe people don't like the concept of that they were led to a conclusion because it sounds like they weren't in control of what they concluded. So instead, I started saying, what helped you draw that conclusion? That they were in charge of it, they drew it, so it was a creative process, and something helped them draw it. So what was it? The second step is listen for interests. So this is something that also comes up in mediation or the court system a lot, and it's positions versus interests. Positions are what we want. Interests are why we want it. It's what we solve by getting it, the problem that goes away from our life if we get it. So let's go to hot take number 4 and look at that example. Their position was, I want no restrictions on my gun ownership. That's their position, no restrictions. That's what I want. So if we dig deeper into, well, why do you want that? It opens up this door to a whole slew of possible explanations. Maybe it's for autonomy or freedom. Maybe they had too many restrictions growing up as a child and they just need that sense of freedom and someone not meddling in their affairs. Maybe it's safety. Maybe they were on a long personal journey of abuse, thinking that they weren't worthy of defense, and they have finally come to the realization that they are worthy of defending, and they see that gun as the way to their safety. Maybe it's personal hobby enjoyment. We all need a way to relax. Maybe they think that without their guns, they would just go crazy and they just wouldn't be able to relax and show up in the world as they want to. Maybe it's nostalgia. Maybe it was a collection for generations that has been built up. And sure, there's all sort of wild and wacky things in there, but they want all of it because it's part of the family. And so when people express their positions, because typically that's what they express, show curiosity so that they start talking more and listen for those interests of why they really want it. And then prove you listened. Exercise patience with monologues and silence. So in order to prove you listened, you actually have to first listen. And so being patient as they keep talking and talking and talking. And if there's any silence, well, they think about more things to say. And so while you're listening, remove judgment and hard words from your mind. Those words that basically act as earplugs or filters for you, where it's like, they always are going to think this. They'll never give me a word in edgewise. They're not thinking straight. They're just all of those things that shut down your ability to genuinely listen to somebody else. And then paraphrase back, which is a simple formula of state the emotion you hear and then summarize the facts that you heard, the facts according to them. Maybe they're not all facts. And so in this case, it would be, geez, you really miss your dad. The hunting trips you two took together taught you how to live a good life, and your guns are a reminder of him and those lessons. Lets them feel heard. And it might be the first time they ever heard articulated what their interest actually is that underlines their position that they're fighting so hard for. So it's an understanding process and a discovery process for both you and them. Now, the first 3 steps: show curiosity. Oh, wow. Pop quiz for myself. Show curiosity. Pop quiz for the audience. What was number 2? Thank you. Listen for interest and then prove you listen. You haven't been doing much talking at this point. And I want to have an illustration here to help hit this home because it was one of the very difficult concepts for me when I first started mediation. So we all have in our minds a tally or scorecard or some sort of tracking of how much airtime we've had in a conversation. You ever get that kind of itch where it's like someone keeps talking and you're like, oh, I really want to say something. It's been too long. I want to get my word in. I want to have my voice heard. So to us, it looks really great when a conversation goes like this between you and somebody that we've labeled the other in this case, where you have a lot of airtime. Maybe they share their position and you're like, well, that's not how the world works. This is how it does. And they say, oh, okay. And you say, good. Glad I could educate you. So there's a part of us, though, that recognizes that this is a little idealistic. It's not quite fair. So technically, something more fair would be equal airtime, something that looks a little bit more like the debate structure, something back and forth, back and forth. And what I'm here to tell you is that yielding and redirecting in a conversation is really hard because it tends to look like this. You don't say much, especially in the beginning. And the beginning of civil discourse can last for a very long time in a conversation. And so when you're struggling with this unequal airtime and you're feeling that sense of discomfort, remember the power of brevity. That just by giving up your airtime doesn't mean that you're giving up your ability to impact the conversation. Speak less by making more of your airtime. Be very intentional. Use those pauses to think about how you really want to redirect the conversation. And if you're questioning the power of brevity, think back to a time where you made a major opinion shift. Go ahead and think about a time. Was it after someone long-windedly talked at you? Was it after even a back and forth debate? Timers and everything. Or was it after someone truly heard you and helped you gently explore a new way of thinking? Those little nudges, those little open-ended questions. Odds are very good that's when it happened. And it can be extremely difficult to be that person for someone else and to reduce your airtime as much as it takes to yield and redirect. But it is absolutely critical in order to make the space for civil discourse. The last step in yield and redirect, no more quizzes, I promise, is look to the future. And so it's respecting the past, accepting the past, but not getting stuck there. This is something we come across a lot in mediation, where people come in with disputes and they want to negotiate the past. But we can't. We cannot change the past. Undergoing mediation training doesn't teach us those powers. Nobody has them. And so the best we can do is understand the past enough until it no longer serves us, and then intentionally step into the future together. All right, so we're going to do another exercise here. So how would you yield and redirect, and I put the little cheater notes for you up there, if someone approached you with this comment? Whites are all racist supremacists. You can't trust any of them. For just existing near them, they'll call the cops on you. And you know what happens when the cops come. How would you respond to this? Go ahead and talk among yourselves. We are at the 2-minute warning. Please be ready to share in 2 minutes. All right, let's come back together and at least share what you have thus far. Because if you're in the moment, you wouldn't have had this long to think about it anyway. So let's see how far you got. Who would like to share how they would yield and redirect this conversation? And it doesn't have to be cohesive. If it's just some thoughts that you have, that's okay. I heard something about keeping Scott out of the conversation.
Sympathy, but basically say like, can't understand, that's all. Trying to start off with that kind of vulnerability.
You're showing that humility too, that you don't understand. You're instead of illuminating that common ground, it's like, I don't know. I don't know how to relate to you on that. Yes. Yes. It is okay to say you don't know. Yes.
Their anger behind this, is there fear behind this?
Mhm.
But the idea of, addressing that emotion, it sounds like you're really worried, angry, something happened, you're fearful, and I think the interest is big. I really appreciate the way you laid out position versus interest. Like maybe the interest here, and I think you need to do some paraphrasing to clarify and make sure that the interest here is what I'm hearing. It sounds like you're feeling really unsafe in your community with the people you're around. That sounds really challenging. So I think figuring out where is that.
I think beautifully said. Very much so. Would anyone like to add anything? Sam. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Exactly. Beautiful. And I mean, spending so much time on the showing curiosity, step number 1, it opens the door. So it's okay to spend time there. Yes.
That's like really opposite, like you see people in their own shoes and kind of like see what they're going through rather than trying to put yourself in that position. So I think it's just the aspect here where it's like show curiosity, but also recognize that you are covered.
Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up a fascinating point that it's something we're really seeing emerging is that line of thought. And I think it's so incredible because, say I'm over here in my shoes, even if we could achieve, okay, I've stepped into your shoes. I'm still me. I've brought everything with me and all my perspectives and all my beliefs and all my experiences. So just because I'm in your shoes doesn't mean I really understand. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
Actually hear someone audibly say this. Like, I can't imagine that. But I can't imagine seeing it online. And I'm like,
Mm.
online. They publicly post something like this. Am I gonna respond publicly? Absolutely. Because then that's like a conversation. Becomes a public conversation. But
Mhm.
maybe I was like, message that. And you're like, hey, saw your post. Never saw you say that before. Like, I'd love to like learn more. You know,
Mhm.
as somebody that is decided, like, like valid. I too have never seen this post. So
Yeah.
like, I'd like, I don't know if I like would take it all the way there. So like, I
Mhm.
would
Mhm. And what I would recommend to everybody in this room, especially to you, is the book called Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. And he actually goes into how they had people from opposing beliefs meet in person to talk about gun control. And what they learned from all of that, they then translated into how to have those interactions online. And so there would be just the perfect chapter for you in that book. All right. So let's move into what this might look like. What I put up on the slide isn't the answer. It is just how I would respond. And so take it with a grain of salt. But I would say, I admit, I don't know what it's like to be Black. You are in fear of people taking away your freedom or even your life. What experiences have you had that led to that distrust? And then to look forward, what do you hope for? It was a very powerful question in order to help redirect. Now, notice there was no defense. It's not saying, well, I'm not a racist. Nope, it wasn't that. There's no judgment. There's not saying, well, you're just paranoid. No. And there's no diminishing, saying, well, it doesn't happen that often. All of those are out of the conversation, and it's just yielding and redirecting. So, in summary, to de escalate, we first focus on ourselves and our own mindset, remembering vulnerability, ownership, communication, acceptance, and boundaries. You're welcome for not quizzing you on that. All right, then recognizing storm and being able to shift the situation into calm using the power of pause and everything you're able to do in that space. And then yield and redirect the conversation. Show curiosity, listen for interest, prove you listened, and then look to the future. Wow, that was part one. And we're at 8:05, but this goes very quickly. Because like I said, everything leading up to the moment is what we've covered. The preparation takes the longest time, and now we are at the moment of civil discourse. So here is an example of how you can structure the conversation. You start with a clear intention. I'm curious to understand your perspective on the upcoming election. Open with curiosity. What are your thoughts on the candidates? Respect the past. What inspired you to think that about each of them? And focus on the future. What are your hopes for the future regarding our nation as a whole? It is that simple and it is that difficult, all in one. And at each stage of the conversation, loop for understanding. This is another concept from the book Super Communicators. The second plug for that. I am not getting any commission for that. I just thought it was a great book. And it states that you ask follow-up questions, you paraphrase what you heard, and then you seek confirmation you understood. And that part is especially important because it's not just we paraphrase back and then we continue on marching on as if we understood them correctly. It's first pausing to seek confirmation that we did understand them correctly, and then being able to rewrite it if we got it wrong, and then move forward together. And it's keep looping until all agree that all understand. And so when I talked about how it's really hard to be this person for somebody else, especially someone you see as your adversary, this is the moment that makes it all worth it. When all agree that all at least understand each other. It is a moment that we come across in mediation where everybody's in storm, and eventually we get to a point where everybody understands each other and their interests and what they're hoping for. And you can just feel the dust of the whirlwind settle. It's an amazingly powerful moment that is usually accompanied by a profound silence. And that is what creates the space for civil discourse. And so it's not enough to just follow the words and follow the structure and the steps. You have to come from a genuine place of wanting to connect with the other person. And so hopefully you all are coming from that place, since I cannot change that. We can't change that in anybody. However, it's also important to appear that you're coming from that place. So it's not enough, just like in mediation, it's not enough to be neutral. The parties have to also believe we're neutral. It comes in both parts. So to help that throughout the conversation, keep being transparent with your intentions, to learn and to relate with them. People might end up defaulting back into, why are you asking so many questions? Are you just trying to find something else to attack in me? Keep reiterating what your intention is. Then build trust. Make them feel heard. This is not a workshop on building trust, but hopefully everything we've covered, you can see the connections to it. Authentically relate where you can. It's that power of me too, without going into a monologue of your own life. It's just saying, I can relate. This happened to me too. Something similar did, etc. And it's illuminating your common ground. And something wonderful in that is that no matter how different our lives are, we all share an emotional common ground. If nothing else, that is our common ground. We all know what pain and fear and disappointment and joy feel like. So if nothing else, you can illuminate that. And respect the past, but don't dwell on it. I'll also close this section with a quote from Alan Alda that I thought was extremely moving. He talked about how true communication requires true listening. And real listening is a willingness to let the other person change you. Just as we talked about in vulnerability and laying down our armor and laying down our weapons, that is that willingness and that openness that lets you truly engage and listen. It doesn't mean they will change you. It's simply your willingness to be open to being changed. And that's what helps create this space. So it's 8:10. I had another exercise for you all. I'm going to task you all with trying to do this outside of this. If you want to stay, then maybe we can. I don't know if we're going to get kicked out. And so the idea was that you would think of a divisive topic that you feel very strongly about. And you would write it down as an inflammatory hot take, if you will. Think if you were to express it when you're in storm and you're at your worst, what would that sound like? And then state that to your partner, and the partner would try to yield and redirect to facilitate civil discourse. I obviously didn't time the workshop quite well enough, and so I apologize. But I do ask that you give this a try. And the partners outside of today won't exactly know about yield and redirecting, so use it as a teaching moment. Try to share what you learned today, and then engage the exercise. Have the ripple effect of this knowledge. All right. Do you all want the summary? We'll run through it just to help it stick. All right. So the fundamentals of de-escalation. These topics become escalated because they hit on our foundational needs as humans. They threaten our view of the world and of our very selves. And they threaten us with a loss that is typically very significant to us. And then with that loss, they ask us to enter the unfamiliar with humility. We typically approach these topics very poorly as people because our default attitudes and reactions are typically unconstructive or destructive. It is very hard to be raised and put out into the world in those sweet spots of how to view conflict and how to default react to it. And so every default reaction to conflict has a story. And those origins can be understood by using the ladder of inference for those with a powerful memory, or the rule of 6 for the most of us. And then how to de-escalate the situation. You first focus on your own mindset. Vulnerability, ownership, communication, acceptance, boundaries. Again, would highly recommend the TED Talk. Recognize storm for what it is, accept it, don't judge it, and then help shift from storm to calm. And then yield and redirect in the conversation. Show curiosity. Listen for those interests. Listen past the positions. Prove you listened, and then look to the future together. The conversation itself. Start with a clear intention. I'm curious to understand your perspective on this. Open with curiosity. What are your thoughts on it? Respect the past. What inspired you to think this about that? Focus on the future. What are your hopes for the future? And throughout, loop for understanding. Seek confirmation that you truly understood them. And try to not only come from a place of genuine connection, but portray that you are coming from a place of genuine connection and be open to being changed by the other person. It takes a nation to preserve democracy. And restoring civil discourse is one significant piece of that. For everybody in this room tonight, we are not the entire solution, but we are all part of the solution. We all have the responsibility to set aside this us versus them facade we've created and engage with those we have seen as our adversaries. First step's the hardest. Letting in their perspective and vulnerably sharing your own. But with time and repetition, this becomes easier. We begin to see that there are very few hard and fast decisions among us that truly stand the test of genuine curiosity. And with enough time and with enough repetition, we begin to see the full spectrum of nuanced perspectives that connect our two extremes. And it is when we can see this that we realize there never really was a them. There was and only is us. And so with this in our minds and in our hearts, let us overcome our ideological divides by restoring the missing piece of civil discourse so that we may see the full spectrum that weaves together our U.S. democracy. Thank you.
We're all going to vote for Kate for president after that. We're going to send you on your way in a second. Governor McCallum's going to say a quick goodbye to everybody.
Well, I was going to give the same pitch sheet at the end, but first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. I was thinking at the start, we were like the first line that went across. If you can encourage others to become part of the movement, the state to do and to learn what we did this evening. We do have a petition. If you could take a petition for people that agree with the same principles, and we believe in WISAC that 85% of the people in the state of Wisconsin do get along and agree, and we don't have to focus on the bad things. But in particular, I wanted to I think Erica may have taken off already, who's part of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. We've got a number of partners that are working with us. The Wisconsin Academy of Arts and Sciences is helping throughout the state, and the Wisconsin Council of Churches is working with us. But anybody we have for support, because sometimes it feels like we're the only ones who care about this. And our point is, if you really are afraid and don't want to get involved, it's a sure way to lose a democracy. And I thought it was great. Thank you for the quote. I'll take the Republican quote from Reagan to the Republicans. But thank you again for caring enough to be here this evening. Please take a petition, even if you get just your family to sign, you can email it back to us. So thank you so much for being here.